Imagine being invited to the biggest wedding in Europe. You arrive in the capital. The king himself greets you. You are given gifts, wine, a place to stay. You feel safe. You feel celebrated. And 6 days later, your neighbors are dragging your body through the streets. This is not a horror story. This is not fiction. This happened in Paris, in the summer of 1572, and it started with a wedding that was supposed to end a war. The bride was Margaret of Valois, sister of King Charles IX of France. The groom was Henry of Navarre, a young Protestant prince from the south. Their marriage was supposed to be a peace treaty dressed in silk. France had been tearing itself apart for over a decade in a series of conflicts we now call the French Wars of Religion. Catholics and Protestants, in France the Protestants were called Huguenots, had been killing each other since 1562. Both sides had burned villages. Both sides had committed atrocities, and both sides were exhausted. So Catherine de Medici, the king's mother and the real power behind the French throne, proposed a radical solution. Marry her daughter to a Huguenot prince. Bring both sides together under one roof. Show Europe that France could coexist. On August 18, 1572, the wedding took place at Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. Margaret of Valois, 20 years old, walked through a cathedral filled with thousands of guests. The ceremony was conducted on a platform outside the cathedral doors, because the Pope had not given permission for a Catholic church to host a Protestant wedding. Margaret later wrote in her memoirs that she barely knew the man she was marrying. She described how she had to be physically nudged to say yes, a small, involuntary shake of her head that her brother interpreted as refusal before she corrected herself. Thousands of Huguenot nobles had traveled to Paris for the wedding. They came armed with hope. Some had not visited the capital in years. They filled the streets, the taverns, the guest rooms of Parisian homes. They wore their finest clothes. They drank and danced alongside Catholics. For 4 days, Paris celebrated. Then, on August 22, someone shot at Admiral Gaspard de Coligny. Coligny was the most important Huguenot military leader in France. He was a calm, dignified man in his 50s, widely respected even by his enemies. He had become a trusted advisor to the young King Charles IX, who was just 22 years old. Coligny was walking back to his lodgings from a meeting at the Louvre when a shot rang out from a window. A bullet struck him in the left hand, and another lodged in his arm. He was carried into his house, bleeding but alive. The Huguenots were furious. They demanded justice. They suspected the Guise family, the most powerful Catholic nobles in France, of ordering the assassination. Henry, Duke of Guise, had publicly sworn vengeance against Coligny for the death of his father years earlier. But suspicion also fell on Catherine de Medici herself, who feared that Coligny's growing influence over her son would drag France into a foreign war against Catholic Spain. No one was ever conclusively proven to have ordered the shooting, but that almost doesn't matter, because what happened next was far worse. Over the next 2 days, Catherine de Medici held a series of secret meetings. Historians like Barbara Diefendorf, who studied the crisis in depth in her book Beneath the Cross, Catholics and Huguenots in 16th century Paris, have reconstructed what likely happened behind those closed doors. Catherine feared that the wounded Coligny would use the assassination attempt to turn the Huguenots against the crown. She and her advisors concluded that the only solution was to strike first, to eliminate the Huguenot leadership before they could organize a response. King Charles IX was persuaded or coerced, depending on which account you believe, into giving the order. According to multiple contemporary witnesses, the young king was in a state of extreme distress. He reportedly paced his room, trembling, and then screamed what became one of history's most chilling commands: "Kill them all! Let none remain to reproach me." The order was given to kill Admiral Coligny and roughly a dozen other Huguenot leaders. But what happened next spiraled completely out of control. In the early morning hours of August 24, the feast day of St. Bartholomew, soldiers loyal to the Duke of Guise went to Coligny's lodgings. They broke down the door. They found the admiral in his nightclothes, still nursing his wounded arm. He was stabbed repeatedly. His body was thrown from the window and landed at the feet of the Duke of Guise, who reportedly wiped blood from his face and said, "I recognize him. It is he." But the killing did not stop with Coligny. A bell began to toll from the church of Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois near the Louvre. It was not the usual morning bell. It was a signal. Catholic militants across Paris heard it and understood what it meant. What followed was a massacre. Huguenots were dragged from their beds, they were stabbed in hallways, they were thrown from windows, they were beaten to death in the streets. The killing was not surgical, it was a frenzy. Within hours, the violence had spread far beyond the original targets. Ordinary Huguenot citizens, merchants, servants, women, children, were being murdered by their Catholic neighbors. Some accounts describe bodies piled so high in the streets that carts had to be brought to carry them away. The Seine ran with blood, or so the accounts say, though historians debate the literal accuracy of that image. The Venetian ambassador, Giovanni Michiel, sent dispatches back to Venice describing the horror. He reported that the king himself stood at a window of the Louvre and fired a musket at fleeing Huguenots. Whether this is true or embellished, it reflects the chaos of those hours. The killing in Paris lasted for days. In the provinces, it continued for weeks. Cities like Lyon, Rouen, Bordeaux, and Toulouse saw their own waves of violence. Historians estimate the total death toll at somewhere between 5,000 and 30,000 people. No one knows the exact number. One of the most vivid accounts comes from Marguerite de Valois herself, the bride. In her memoirs, written years later, she describes how Huguenot nobles who had attended her wedding just days earlier came fleeing to her chambers, begging for protection. She recounts a young Huguenot man who burst into her room and clung to her, shouting that he would not leave her side because the soldiers would not dare harm the king's sister. Guards tried to drag him away. Marguerite intervened. She managed to save his life, but outside her door people were dying. Henry of Navarre, the groom, survived only by converting to Catholicism. He was held essentially as a prisoner at the French court for years before eventually escaping. He would later become King Henry IV of France and issue the Edict of Nantes, granting religious tolerance to Protestants. But that was decades away. In the summer of 1572, he was a frightened young man who had just watched his friends and allies murdered. And here is what makes this event truly disturbing. The Pope celebrated it. When news reached Rome, Pope Gregory XIII ordered a Te Deum, a hymn of thanksgiving, to be sung in the churches. He commissioned a special commemorative medal. He had the artist Giorgio Vasari paint a fresco in the Vatican showing the massacre as a triumph of the faith. To the papacy, the killing of thousands of Protestants was not a tragedy. It was answered prayer. The Huguenot minister Simon Goulart compiled eyewitness testimonies of the massacre and published them in exile, creating one of the most important primary source collections for understanding what happened. His work circulated across Europe and horrified Protestant nations. England's Queen Elizabeth I, who had nearly married a French Catholic prince just months earlier, went into mourning and reportedly hung the French ambassador's portrait in her privy, the toilet, as a sign of contempt. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre did not end the wars of religion. It made them worse. France would continue to bleed for another quarter century. The idea that Catholics and Protestants could coexist peacefully in France was shattered. Trust between the communities, already fragile, was annihilated. A generation of Huguenots who had believed in reconciliation now believed only in survival. The massacre also had a profound effect on political thought across Europe. It demonstrated, in the starkest possible terms, what happened when religious authority and political power merged without restraint. In the centuries that followed, the memory of August 24, 1572, became an argument for tolerance, not because tolerance is easy, but because the alternative has a body count. So what does this have to do with you? You live in a world where people still organize themselves into groups and demonize the other side, where neighbors who share streets and markets can be turned against each other by fear and political manipulation. The wedding massacre of 1572 was not caused by ancient, unsolvable hatred. It was caused by fear, by political calculation, by a small group of powerful people who decided that their enemies were too dangerous to live alongside, and that violence was the only rational choice. And the people who paid the price were not the ones making those decisions. They were the guests, the merchants, the families, the people who had come to Paris believing that peace was possible. The wedding was real, the massacre was real, and the distance between celebration and slaughter turned out to be just 6 days.